Elizabeth's life began under the heavy shadow of royalty, yet it was far from a childhood of innocence or freedom. Born to Henry V and Anne Boleyn in 1533, she entered a world governed by politics, suspicion, and relentless ambition. From the very first breath, she was both a symbol of hope and a potential pawn in a dangerous game that stretched across palaces, courts, and the minds of men and women with ambitions as sharp as swords. Her earliest years were filled with contradictions. Elizabeth was celebrated for her intelligence, her charm, and her keen perception. But she was also reminded constantly of her precarious place in the line of succession. Her mother's position as queen was tenuous, always under threat from those who feared Anne Boleyn's influence or desired power for themselves. Even as a young girl, Elizabeth learned that the world measured value not in affection, but in usefulness, loyalty, and alignment with ambition. The court was a place of constant observation. Every gesture, word, and expression mattered. Elizabeth's tutors, nannies, and attendants watched her closely. They praised her accomplishments. Yet the praise was rarely free of expectation. Education was rigorous, but it was never just about knowledge, it was preparation. Preparation for scrutiny, for political pressure, for a life in which every decision could alter the fates of kingdoms and families alike. Her books were not merely for learning. They were tools to sharpen her mind, to teach strategy, logic, history, and the subtle art of discernment. The lessons were gentle in appearance, but they carried the weight of survival. Elizabeth's relationship with her parents shaped much of her early perception of power and danger. Henry V was imposing, his temper legendary and his expectations exacting. Anne Boleyn, her mother, was ambitious, intelligent, and politically savvy, yet vulnerable in a court that favored tradition and despised dissent. Elizabeth observed the tension between them, absorbing the knowledge that even those closest to you could be endangered by forces beyond their control. She saw fear, ambition, and manipulation mingling in ways both overt and subtle, and she began to understand the precarious nature of existence in royal circles. The fall of Anne Boleyn was Elizabeth's first real encounter with fear. When her mother was executed on charges of treason and adultery, Elizabeth was only a toddler. Though her memory of the event may have been fragmented, the aftershocks shaped her life indelibly. She was declared illegitimate, her place in the succession uncertain, and her status reduced. Elizabeth experienced the cruelty of politics firsthand, even before she could fully comprehend it. She learned that affection did not guarantee protection, that titles could vanish overnight, and that survival often depended on silence, discretion, and the careful observation of others. Life after her mother's execution was a mixture of neglect, careful protection, and subtle education in endurance. Elizabeth was placed in the care of servants and governesses who guided her behavior, educated her, and subtly trained her to navigate danger. Some were kind, offering warmth and gentle guidance, but others were more focused on discipline, teaching her early lessons in self-restraint and awareness. Even as a child, she learned to manage her emotions, to measure her reactions, and to speak in ways that reflected intelligence, without betraying vulnerability. Emotional expression became a controlled skill, one that would serve her in the complex and often treacherous world she would soon inherit. Education was central to Elizabeth's development, and her tutors were among the most learned scholars of the time. They taught her multiple languages, including Latin, French, and Greek, as well as subjects like history, theology, philosophy, and rhetoric. But the lessons went beyond academics. They were exercises in mental discipline, training Elizabeth to analyze situations, interpret motives, and anticipate consequences. Each story from history was a lesson in power, survival, and human behavior. Each translation exercise was a subtle test of patience and precision. Elizabeth absorbed it all, not only for knowledge, but as preparation for the heavy crown that would one day rest upon her head. Even play, when it existed, carried a shadow of formality. Games were carefully monitored. Competitions measured and achievements noted. Praise and correction were deliberate, reinforcing the notion that every action, however minor, could reflect character and capability. Elizabeth's awareness of observation deepened through these interactions. She learned to moderate exuberance, hide fear, and cultivate curiosity without exposing naivety. In essence, she began practicing the art of self-preservation early, learning that innocence could be dangerous, and that perception often mattered more than reality. Elizabeth's relationship with her siblings further complicated her early years. Half-brothers and half-sisters, products of her father's marriages, were both companions and reminders of her precarious standing. Some offered affection, others rivalry, and many were tools in the ongoing political calculations of adults. Elizabeth navigated these relationships carefully, learning to distinguish loyalty from opportunism. Trust was not freely given, it had to be tested and earned, sometimes subtly and over long periods. These early experiences refined her instincts, teaching her the nuances of human behavior in ways that would serve her for decades. The court itself was a living, breathing environment of intrigue. Elizabeth observed ministers, ambassadors, nobles, and courtiers, learning the subtle art of diplomacy without fully understanding it consciously. Each gesture, each word, each slight expression conveyed potential allegiance or threat. As a child, Elizabeth absorbed the rhythm of power, its unpredictability, its cruelty, and its quiet strategies. She learned to anticipate actions before they occurred, to perceive danger lurking behind politeness, and to measure reactions in silence. Observation became as critical to survival as any academic skill. Religion, too, played a central role in Elizabeth's upbringing. The Reformation was in full swing, and England was a nation divided. Elizabeth's early exposure to theological debates, church politics, and differing loyalties instilled in her a deep awareness of the social and political consequences of belief. Even as a child, she sensed that faith was more than a personal conviction, it was a tool for power, a source of cohesion, and sometimes a cause for deadly action. This awareness shaped her careful approach to religion later in life, teaching her that neutrality and balance could be both shields and weapons. Despite the challenges, Elizabeth possessed remarkable resilience. She observed quietly, learned swiftly, and adapted continuously. Her early experiences instilled a mix of caution and courage, allowing her to navigate a world where the innocent were often the first to fall. She developed a sense of detachment, a skill that enabled her to survive emotionally while engaging politically. Elizabeth's childhood, though filled with shadows, cultivated the foundation of a ruler capable of extraordinary endurance and foresight. Sleep in her early years was not always restful. Nights were often punctuated by anxiety, uncertainty, and the echoes of palace intrigue. Even at a young age, Elizabeth sensed the fragility of her position. Her subconscious absorbed the dangers, the betrayals, and the constant watchfulness demanded by those around her. Dreams were tinged with the shadows of authority and fear, preparing her mind for a future in which vigilance would never fully rest. In this way, even unconscious hours contributed to her understanding of the precariousness of life as a royal. Elizabeth's early relationships with caretakers and advisors were also lessons in influence and power dynamics. She learned how affection could be conditional, how loyalty could be transactional, and how information could be weaponized. Every interaction, however mundane it seemed, carried an underlying lesson about human behavior. Elizabeth internalized these lessons, building a mental map of strategy, caution, and observation that would later allow her to manage entire governments, and navigate the treacherous world of politics, with exceptional skill. Her early life was defined by the interplay of observation, restraint, and preparation. Elizabeth learned to internalize fear and convert it into vigilance, to moderate desire and channel it into ambition, and to balance curiosity with caution. These qualities became the core of her personality, forming the psychological framework that would carry her through decades of rulership, danger, and isolation. Even as a child, she developed the mental stamina to endure uncertainty, disappointment, and the constant pressure of expectations. In moments of solitude, Elizabeth reflected in ways that even a child could sense were profound. She observed the adults around her, interpreted their motives, and rehearsed responses internally. She imagined outcomes, considered consequences, and tested strategies in the quiet of her mind. These exercises were invisible to the world, but they sharpened her intellect, disciplined her emotions, and refined her instincts. The seeds of her later mastery of court politics were sown in these silent, contemplative hours. By the time Elizabeth approached her teenage years, she had become acutely aware of the fragility of status, the weight of observation, and the subtle currents of human ambition. Her education, her interactions, and her experiences combined to forge a child uniquely prepared for the extraordinary challenge that lay ahead. She was no longer merely a daughter of the king. She was a carefully trained observer, strategist, and survivor, equipped to navigate a world in which innocence could be fatal. Elizabeth's childhood shadows were long, but they were formative. They shaped a queen who would survive betrayal, intrigue, and perilous politics. They created a ruler whose intellect, foresight, and endurance would be unmatched. Every fear, every lesson, every observation contributed to the development of a mind capable of managing kingdoms, negotiating alliances, and commanding loyalty while bearing the silent burdens of power. And so, as the young Elizabeth moved quietly through the halls of palaces, listened to whispered conversations, and observed the intricate dances of ambition and fear, she began to understand the essential truth of her existence, that to survive, to rule, and to endure, one must always see the shadows, anticipate the danger, and carry the weight of the world in silence. Even as a child, Elizabeth's life was already a testament to vigilance, intelligence, and the quiet endurance that would define her for decades to come. Elizabeth's adolescence was marked by sudden changes, uncertainty, and the constant shadow of danger. The Tower of London, a place of confinement, observation, and whispered rumors, became both a symbol of peril and a crucible for her developing mind. Though she was never formally imprisoned like her mother, the tower's walls represented the fragility of her existence and the ever-present consequences of political maneuvering. The tower loomed not only physically, but psychologically. It was a space of power and fear, of whispers and decisions that could determine life or death. Elizabeth understood that its history was steeped in treachery, imprisonment, and executions. Each stone seemed to echo with warnings, reminders that even those closest to the throne were vulnerable. The young Elizabeth's lessons with quiet intensity, watching, listening, and internalizing the dangerous rhythms of court politics. Life in the tower brought Elizabeth into contact with a rigid structure of authority. Guards, attendants, and officials maintained order, but their loyalty was always measured. Each interaction required careful observation, each conversation was assessed for intent, and every gesture had significance. Elizabeth learned quickly that appearances could be deceiving. Even small slips could be exploited, and trust, once given, could be weaponized against her. She honed her instincts, noting subtle behaviors, analyzing motivations, and rehearsing appropriate responses. The constant surveillance was exhausting. Elizabeth could not relax fully. Every shadow, every creaking floorboard, and every unexpected visitor held the potential for threat. She became accustomed to living under observation, to moderating her movements and her speech. Silence became a tool, restraint a necessity, and patience a critical skill. Through these early lessons, Elizabeth cultivated a profound understanding of human nature, and the mechanisms of control that would define her later reign. Education continued even within these confines, though with a new intensity. Tutors and advisors remained close, not merely teaching language, history, and philosophy, but guiding Elizabeth in the subtler arts of negotiation, persuasion, and strategic thinking. She was instructed in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, not only to broaden her intellect, but to prepare her for correspondence and diplomacy with powerful foreign nations. Elizabeth absorbed every lesson, recognizing that knowledge was as essential to survival as vigilance or physical safety. Isolation heightened her self-reliance. Friends were few, and alliances were tenuous. Elizabeth learned to rely on her own judgment, to measure consequences carefully, and to act decisively when necessary. This solitude was not merely physical. It was a mental discipline, training her to maintain composure, assess risk, and navigate danger even when support was uncertain or absent. Each day reinforced the importance of independence, mental fortitude, and strategic patience. The political landscape outside the Tower was treacherous. Elizabeth's father, Henry V, had already demonstrated the brutal consequences of perceived disloyalty or threat. Her mother's execution lingered as a constant reminder that no one was immune, that even proximity to the crown carried risk. Elizabeth learned to interpret events critically, to distinguish genuine opportunity from hidden danger, and to anticipate potential threats before they materialized. Observation and analysis became second nature. Even mundane aspects of daily life were fraught with meaning. Conversations, meals, and gestures were all potential tests of loyalty or intelligence. Elizabeth learned to decode subtle messages, to recognize hidden motives, and to respond with a combination of patience and strategy. She developed a keen sense of timing, understanding when to speak, when to act, and when to wait. These skills, cultivated in the Tower's constrained environment, would later prove essential for governing a nation. Sleep remained elusive. The knowledge that danger could arrive at any moment, that fortunes could change overnight, or that betrayal could lurk nearby made rest light and cautious. Dreams were often filled with echoes of political intrigue, hypothetical threats, and rehearsals of response. Even unconscious hours contributed to her understanding of human behavior, strategy, and the constant vigil required to navigate life in the shadow of power. Religious and ideological tensions added further complexity. Elizabeth was acutely aware of the Reformation's impact on England, of the divisions between Catholics and Protestants, and of the dangers inherent in navigating these currents. Within the Tower's walls, she observed how faith could be manipulated, how allegiance could be questioned, and how loyalty could be tested through subtle coercion. She began to recognize the subtle interplay between belief, authority, and survival, lessons that would later inform her careful, pragmatic approach to governance. Elizabeth's awareness of mortality deepened during this period. The fate of her mother, the political execution surrounding the court, and the constant whispers of threat reinforced a sense of impermanence. Life, she learned, was fragile, and even proximity to power did not guarantee safety. These lessons in mortality honed her instincts, sharpened her decision-making, and instilled a deep appreciation for patience, caution, and prudence. Even relationships were governed by strategy. Elizabeth observed the behavior of attendants, tutors and visitors, learning to discern loyalty, self-interest, and hidden motives. Trust became a measured resource, to be granted selectively and cautiously. Emotional restraint became essential, as vulnerability could be exploited and attachment could become a liability. Elizabeth internalized these lessons, recognizing that the strength of a ruler depended not only on intellect, but on the capacity to navigate human complexity, without compromising safety. The lessons of confinement extended beyond survival, they shaped character. Elizabeth learned to transform fear into focus, isolation into reflection, and observation into understanding. Each day in the Tower reinforced the connection between knowledge, vigilance, and authority. The young princess absorbed the necessity of foresight, patience, and strategic thinking, building the foundation of a ruler capable of navigating treacherous political landscapes with clarity and composure. Even moments of quiet reflection were infused with strategy. Elizabeth considered hypothetical scenarios, rehearsed potential conversations, and imagined responses to threats that might arise. These exercises were mental training, refining judgment and reinforcing resilience. Her mind became a repository of strategies, insights and contingency plans, all stored beneath a calm, composed exterior. The Tower was both a prison and a classroom. Its walls enclosed not only her body, but her mind, shaping her awareness, her instincts, and her capacity for endurance. Elizabeth emerged from this environment with a keen understanding of human behavior, the subtle mechanics of power, and the constant necessity of vigilance. She had learned that authority required observation, restraint, and patience, that survival depended on discretion, strategy, and emotional discipline, and that the path of a queen was lined with shadows, uncertainty, and the ever-present possibility of danger. By the time Elizabeth left the Tower, she was no longer merely a princess defined by her lineage. She had become a student of human nature, a practitioner of observation and strategy, and a survivor of political peril. The lessons learned in these early years, about vigilance, patience, emotional control, and the subtle dynamics of loyalty and betrayal, would remain with her for life, forming the foundation of her capacity to rule with intelligence, caution, and resilience. The Tower, with its quiet menace, oppressive walls, and constant observation, had taught Elizabeth her first enduring truth's power was fragile. Trust was conditional, and survival required constant attention, discipline, and foresight. In the shadows of confinement, she had cultivated the mind, temperament, and instincts of a ruler who would one day navigate the complexities of an entire kingdom with unmatched skill and composure. Elizabeth's adolescence was defined not only by survival, but by the shaping of her intellect, character, and strategic mind. Her education, rigorous and comprehensive, became the foundation upon which her authority, diplomacy, and resilience would be built. In the quiet halls of her tutor's chambers, she absorbed lessons that transcended mere academics, preparing her to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of power that awaited her. From the earliest days of formal learning, Elizabeth demonstrated remarkable curiosity and discipline. Her tutors, highly educated scholars of the era, introduced her to languages that would later enable correspondence with foreign rulers, ministers, heirs, and Latin, Greek, French, and Italian were not simply subjects, they were instruments of influence. Mastery of these languages allowed Elizabeth to understand foreign texts, read original works of philosophy and law, and communicate directly with diplomats. Knowledge, she discovered, was a form of armor, protecting her from deception and enabling her to wield authority with precision. But her education extended far beyond language. History provided her with insight into patterns of power, human behavior, and the consequences of decisions. She studied past rulers, wars, alliances, and rebellions, absorbing lessons about courage, prudence, and folly. Through the examples of others, Elizabeth learned to anticipate outcomes, recognize hidden motives, and appreciate the fragile balance between authority and vulnerability. Each story was a lesson in survival. Every example a subtle guide for the challenges she would face as a ruler. Philosophy and theology were equally central to her training. Elizabeth was instructed in moral reasoning, ethics, and religious debates, developing the capacity to understand complex, conflicting viewpoints. In a nation divided by Reformation tensions, such knowledge was not abstract, it was essential for navigating political and social currents. Understanding the beliefs, fears, and ambitions of her subjects and advisors allowed Elizabeth to craft policies that balanced pragmatism with perception, authority with patience. The seeds of her famously careful religious policies were sown in these early studies. Rhetoric and persuasion became crucial skills. Elizabeth learned not only to speak well, but to influence subtly, inspire loyalty, and deflect criticism. Every lesson in argumentation and debate prepared her for a future where words could be as powerful as armies. she understood that authority required the ability to communicate decisively, convincingly, and with nuance. A well-chosen phrase could calm unrest, strengthen allegiance, or intimidate a rival, while a misstep could provoke rebellion, doubt, or betrayal. Physical education was also part of her training. Elizabeth was instructed in riding, dancing, fencing, and etiquette. Each activity reinforced discipline, poise, and the awareness of personal presence. These skills were not merely recreational. They were essential tools for managing appearances, commanding respect, and projecting authority. Elizabeth internalized the principle that perception could be as decisive as action, that the image of a queen could influence loyalty, fear, and admiration alike. The interplay of observation, reflection, and action was a constant theme in her education. Tutors emphasized the importance of measuring reactions, anticipating intentions, and interpreting subtleties in speech and behavior. Elizabeth learned to listen as carefully as she spoke, to watch as carefully as she moved, and to consider the consequences of her choices with painstaking detail. This disciplined approach became second nature, a skill that would later allow her to navigate intrigues, plots, and political negotiations with extraordinary precision. Even friendships and relationships were approached with strategic awareness. Elizabeth observed how alliances formed, how loyalty shifted, and how influence was exercised in subtle ways. She learned to differentiate between genuine connection and calculated interest, internalizing the principle that trust must be measured and granted selectively. Emotional restraint, cultivated from childhood, became essential for both survival and effective governance. Elizabeth's early exposure to courtly politics further honed her understanding of influence. She observed the interactions of nobles, advisors, and foreign envoys, noting patterns in ambition, flattery, and manipulation. The young princess began to grasp the subtle mechanisms of power, who held real authority, whose support could be counted on, and whose influence masked hidden agendas. Observation, she realized, was as crucial as knowledge or skill. The ability to discern motives often determined survival in the treacherous environment of the court. The concept of reputation also became central to Elizabeth's education. Tutors and advisors impressed upon her that perception could shape destiny. Appearances mattered. Gestures, expressions, and demeanor could inspire loyalty, instill fear, or provoke envy. Elizabeth learned to manage her image carefully, understanding that even minor missteps could be magnified into scandal or misinterpretation. Discipline in public and private conduct became intertwined, forming the foundation for a queen capable of projecting authority, while maintaining control over perception. Religious education remained a persistent focus. Elizabeth was taught to navigate theological debates with intelligence and caution, understanding the potential consequences of her beliefs and actions. She internalized the importance of balancing personal conviction with political necessity, recognizing that missteps in faith could destabilize alliances, provoke rebellion, or invite foreign intervention. This awareness fostered the careful, pragmatic religious policies that would later define her reign. The mental discipline cultivated through education extended to problem-solving and contingency planning. Elizabeth was encouraged to consider multiple outcomes, evaluate risks, and develop strategies to address unexpected challenges. Exercises in debate analysis and hypothetical scenarios trained her to think critically and adapt quickly. She developed the ability to weigh options calmly, anticipate consequences, and make decisions under pressure, a skill set that would later prove invaluable in managing the complexities of a kingdom. Elizabeth's education was not solely academic. It was deeply practical, shaping both intellect and character. She learned resilience through challenge, patience through instruction, and discernment through observation. Each lesson reinforced the understanding that power demanded preparation, intelligence, and unwavering attention to detail. Knowledge was not merely a tool, it was a shield, a means of survival, and a foundation for leadership. The young princess also cultivated an awareness of the fragility of life and authority. Her mother's execution, her father's temper, and the shifting dynamics of the court instilled a sober understanding of mortality and vulnerability. Elizabeth internalized these realities, learning to navigate fear, uncertainty, and instability with measured composure. Her mind became a repository of strategies, insights, and contingencies, quietly building the framework for a ruler capable of enduring adversity without compromise. Isolation, while challenging, reinforced her self-reliance. Elizabeth had few peers who could comprehend the pressures she faced. Relationships were often instrumental, filtered through necessity and strategy. This solitude, however, allowed her to focus, observe, and develop a depth of understanding unmatched by most of her contemporaries. She learned to manage internal emotion, cultivate mental resilience, and prioritize the demands of survival and leadership above personal comfort. By the time Elizabeth approached the threshold of adulthood, her education had produced a mind finely tuned to the challenges of governance. She had mastered languages, absorbed history, navigated philosophy and theology, honed rhetoric, and cultivated strategic observation. She had learned to read human motives, anticipate threats, manage relationships, and project authority. The skills and instincts developed during these formative years would become the tools with which she would govern England, with extraordinary skill, endurance, and foresight. Even in quiet moments of reflection, Elizabeth rehearsed scenarios, considered responses, and evaluated potential consequences. Her mental exercises were not idle. They were continuous preparation for the intricate and dangerous world she was destined to navigate. Knowledge, discipline, observation, and restraint formed the foundation of her identity. Each day reinforced the lessons of survival, strategy, and perception, shaping a princess who was already, in essence, a sovereign in training. Elizabeth's adolescence, therefore, was not a simple coming of age, but a deliberate shaping of intellect, character, and resilience. Education became the crucible in which she forged the mental tools necessary to govern a nation, survive threats, and maintain authority in the face of intrigue and danger. By the time she reached adulthood, Elizabeth was prepared not only to inherit a throne, but to wield power with skill, foresight, and unflinching determination. And so, as she moved through the halls of her tutor's chambers, listened to the debates of scholars, and observed the machinations of court and family, Elizabeth internalized a truth that would guide her for life: knowledge, observation, and discipline were not merely advantages, they were essential to survival, authority, and the enduring legacy of a queen who would come to shape history in ways no one could have predicted. As Elizabeth approached early adulthood, the distant echo of her father's reign faded, leaving behind a world steeped in expectation, danger, and the complex machinery of monarchy. The crown, heavy and luminous, beckoned as both an opportunity and a burden. For Elizabeth, the path to authority was neither simple nor straightforward. It was paved with intrigue, observation, and the constant management of perception. Every step in court life was carefully calculated, every gesture measured for potential consequence. The court itself was a world of constant observation and subtle competition. Nobles, advisors, and foreign envoys moved in a delicate dance of ambition and influence. Every glance, word, and expression was loaded with significance. Elizabeth quickly learned that appearances could be deceptive, that loyalty could be feigned, and that ambition often concealed hidden agendas. The court was a living organism of shifting alliances, delicate balances, and silent calculations, and Elizabeth's education had prepared her to navigate it with extraordinary precision. Elizabeth's charm, intelligence, and grace became both weapons and shields. Her ability to engage with courtiers and diplomats, to converse with subtlety, and to demonstrate knowledge without arrogance, allowed her to command attention without provoking envy or hostility. Yet this careful balance required constant awareness. A misstep in tone, a poorly chosen word, or an unguarded smile could be interpreted as weakness or favoritism. Elizabeth learned to modulate her presence, projecting authority while remaining vigilant and discreet. Political alliances were critical at this stage. The young princess observed the intricate negotiations of marriage, favor, and influence that dominated court life. These alliances were rarely about affection, they were instruments of power. Elizabeth understood that each relationship could shift the balance of authority, strengthen claims, or introduce threats. She began to cultivate strategic friendships and manage potential rivals with tact, observation, and patience. This early training in diplomacy would later become a defining feature of her reign. The shadow of succession loomed over every interaction. Elizabeth's position as heir, though contested at times, made her the focus of attention, speculation, and calculation. Courtiers whispered about marriage prospects, foreign alliances, and potential heirs. The question of legitimacy, long a concern since her mother's execution, continued to shape perceptions and influence behavior. Elizabeth learned to navigate these tensions with careful diplomacy, balancing curiosity, patience, and assertiveness. Awareness of her precarious position sharpened her strategic thinking and heightened her vigilance. Even leisure was infused with subtle politics. Dancing, music, and ceremonial displays were not merely entertainment, they were stages upon which influence and hierarchy were enacted. Elizabeth observed how individuals maneuvered for favor, how alliances shifted in whispers and gestures, and how status was reinforced through subtle cues. She learned to participate gracefully, to observe astutely, and to internalize lessons about human behavior that would later prove invaluable in governance and negotiation. Religious tensions further complicated court life. England, divided between Protestant reformers and Catholic traditionalists, was a nation in ideological flux. Elizabeth understood that religion was never purely personal, it was intertwined with politics, loyalty, and power. Every statement, gesture, and association carried potential consequence. She observed how religious affiliation could strengthen authority, provoke rebellion, or attract foreign attention. These lessons in prudence, moderation, and strategic neutrality would later define her careful religious policies, balancing conviction with survival. The threat of betrayal remained constant. Elizabeth recognized that even those closest to her could act with self-interest, ambition, or fear. Observing interactions between courtiers, analyzing intentions behind words and gestures, and discerning subtle shifts in loyalty became a daily exercise. She developed the capacity to anticipate moves before they were executed, to prepare responses to unspoken threats, and to navigate conflicts with foresight. In doing so, she transformed vigilance into a skill of survival and strategy. Letters, reports, and news from distant provinces became instruments of information and control. Elizabeth read correspondence with careful attention, parsing meaning from nuance and considering the broader implications for alliances, policy, and authority. Every message could carry vital intelligence, subtle threat, or opportunity for leverage. Her ability to process information, assess reliability, and act decisively honed her capacity for governance, and shaped her approach to diplomacy, administration, and personal security. Elizabeth's awareness of public perception grew sharper. She understood that her image, carefully cultivated through appearances, speeches, and behavior, influenced loyalty, fear, and admiration. Courtiers, subjects, and foreign observers evaluated her constantly. Every gesture of compassion, strength, or decisiveness carried consequences. She learned to project confidence without arrogance, wisdom without rigidity, and authority without isolation. Maintaining this delicate balance required constant attention, mental discipline, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Education, observation, and experience combined to sharpen her strategic acumen. Elizabeth learned to weigh risks, anticipate outcomes, and respond with precision. Each encounter in court, each negotiation, and each decision became an opportunity to practice foresight, judgment, and diplomacy. She internalized the principle that knowledge, awareness, and patience were as crucial to survival as courage or force. These lessons would serve her in the complex challenges of ruling a kingdom. The crown, looming ever closer, was both promise and burden. Elizabeth felt the weight of expectation from advisors, courtiers and foreign powers. Every miscalculation could jeopardize alliances, provoke rebellion, or undermine authority. Yet she also understood that the opportunity to rule offered a chance to shape England according to her vision, guided by intellect, strategy and observation. The path to power required patience, resilience, and an unyielding commitment to vigilance. Isolation continued to influence her behavior. Even among allies and advisors, Elizabeth maintained a careful distance. Trust was selective, and emotional restraint was necessary to prevent manipulation or exploitation. Relationships were evaluated for loyalty, influence, and strategic potential. This discipline, while sometimes lonely, reinforced her capacity to make objective decisions, maintain control, and navigate complex political terrain without undue bias or vulnerability. By the time she reached the threshold of her reign, Elizabeth had internalized a profound understanding of human nature, authority, and the delicate interplay of power. Her education, observation, and strategic experience had produced a mind capable of navigating intrigue, managing alliances, and responding to threats with calculated precision. She was prepared to assume a throne not simply as a ceremonial figure, but as a ruler equipped to survive, lead, and influence with unmatched skill. Even moments of reflection were infused with foresight. Elizabeth rehearsed speeches, considered political strategies, and envisioned potential challenges. Mental exercises, contemplation of human behavior, and anticipation of outcomes became constant companions, reinforcing her strategic capacity and preparing her for the weight of rulership. Knowledge, observation, and patience intertwined to create a foundation of authority rooted in understanding, foresight and vigilance. Court intrigue, the crown's allure, and the constant interplay of ambition and loyalty defined Elizabeth's early adulthood. She emerged not merely as a princess awaiting succession, but as a perceptive, disciplined, and strategically aware individual. Her capacity for observation, her mastery of diplomacy, and her understanding of human motives distinguished her from her peers. These attributes, honed through education and experience, would become central to her survival, influence, and eventual success as England's queen. As Elizabeth moved gracefully through the halls of the palace, observing, listening, and learning, she embraced a truth that would guide her entire reign. Power demanded constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and the ability to navigate human complexity with intelligence, composure, and patience. Every gesture, word, and decision was an exercise in shaping perception, asserting authority, and securing influence. The lessons of court intrigue, carefully absorbed and practiced, prepared her for the extraordinary responsibilities that awaited. By the time Elizabeth reached the age of potential succession, the world she inhabited was one of ceaseless vigilance, subtle danger, and intricate political webs. Threats emerged not only from obvious adversaries but from hidden currents, concealed ambitions, and shifting loyalties. The kingdom she was poised to inherit required constant awareness, strategic insight, and the ability to balance firmness with diplomacy. Internal threats were a constant concern. England's noble families, powerful and ambitious, frequently maneuvered for influence, prestige and power. Each alliance, marriage arrangement, or favor could tilt the balance of authority, subtly undermining Elizabeth's position or challenging her legitimacy. She observed these movements carefully, recognizing the hidden stakes behind every conversation, gesture, and decision. Early exposure to these dynamics sharpened her analytical mind, enabling her to detect potential before it became overtly manifest. The question of succession amplified every internal tension. Elizabeth's legitimacy had been questioned from birth, complicated by her mother's execution and her father's subsequent marriages. Supporters and opponents alike scrutinized every action, weighing its impact on claims to the throne. Courtiers speculated, foreign powers whispered, and domestic factions tested boundaries. Elizabeth internalized these pressures. Learning the importance of patience, discretion, and the cultivation of allies whose loyalty could be counted upon. Elizabeth's intelligence allowed her to navigate the delicate politics of court with remarkable skill. She understood that appearances mattered as much as reality. A carefully worded remark, a measured response to an inquiry, or a subtle display of deference could influence perceptions, reinforce authority, and neutralize potential threats. These interactions were exercises in diplomacy, strategy, and psychological insight, refining her capacity to anticipate challenges and respond with calculated precision. Foreign threats compounded the complexity of her environment. England's position in Europe was tenuous, influenced by religious, political, and dynastic considerations. Catholic powers, wary of a Protestant ruler and concerned about succession, monitored developments closely. Ambassadors, envoys, and spies conveyed intelligence, negotiated influence, and tested boundaries. Elizabeth's understanding of these international dynamics deepened over time, as she learned to interpret motives, assess credibility, and weigh risks before taking action. Religious divisions added another layer of challenge. The Reformation had found ideological fault lines, with Protestants and Catholics often in tension. Elizabeth understood that her approach to faith would shape loyalty, provoke dissent, and influence alliances. She carefully observed how beliefs intersected with politics, noting how clergy, nobles, and commoners responded to doctrinal issues. Her emerging strategy emphasized balance, pragmatism, and careful management of perception, avoiding unnecessary provocation while maintaining authority. The threat of intrigue, espionage, and conspiracy required constant vigilance. Elizabeth's early exposure to the machinations of court and family had honed her ability to detect duplicity, anticipate plots, and assess the reliability of information. She developed a keen sense of human behavior, noticing inconsistencies, evaluating motives, and preparing responses to potential challenges. This vigilance became a cornerstone of her leadership style, allowing her to navigate both and external dangers with exceptional foresight. Even personal relationships required strategic consideration. Elizabeth observed potential allies and confidants carefully, weighing loyalty, influence, and ambition. Trust was selective, granted cautiously, and continually reassessed. Emotional restraint became essential, vulnerability could be exploited, and misjudgment could result in scandal, loss of power, or physical danger. Through careful observation, calculation, and patience, Elizabeth cultivated relationships that reinforced her position while minimizing risk. Education and reflection reinforced these lessons. Elizabeth continued to study history, politics, and strategy, using past events to inform present decisions. She analyzed the successes and failures of rulers, the dynamics of power, and the consequences of action and inaction. Each observation became a tool for survival, a guide for negotiation, and a framework for decision-making. The combination of intellectual preparation, experiential learning, and vigilant observation equipped her to navigate an environment rife with danger. Even leisure was an arena for strategy. Court entertainments, ceremonial dances, and public appearances provided opportunities to assess loyalty, gauge influence, and reinforce hierarchy. Elizabeth engaged with grace and subtlety, projecting authority while observing responses, noting behaviors, and internalizing lessons about ambition, allegiance, and perception. Every interaction, no matter how casual it seemed, contributed to her understanding of human nature and the mechanisms of power. The psychological toll of these pressures was significant. Elizabeth's early experiences had instilled resilience, but the constant awareness of potential threat demanded mental stamina. Sleep was often light, reflection continuous, and contemplation focused on preparation, assessment, and strategy. Even moments of solitude were shaped by awareness of risk, requiring constant mental discipline and the cultivation of composure under pressure. Elizabeth's mastery of observation, communication, and strategic planning allowed her to navigate threats with increasing confidence. She anticipated challenges before they materialized, interpreted subtle cues from allies and adversaries alike, and maintained a balance between firmness and flexibility. These skills were critical for survival, ensuring that her authority remained intact even in the face of shifting alliances, domestic tension, and foreign pressure. By early adulthood, Elizabeth had developed an acute awareness of both visible and hidden threats. She understood that survival required continuous vigilance, the careful cultivation of alliances, and the ability to respond decisively when necessary. Her education and experience provided the tools to assess risk, manage influence, and maintain authority in a world where power was contested, loyalty was conditional, and perception often outweighed reality. Elizabeth's approach combined intellect, patience, and strategic subtlety. She learned to measure responses, consider long-term consequences, and act with precision. The combination of careful observation, disciplined thought, and practical action allowed her to maintain a position of strength, while minimizing exposure to danger. These qualities would define her reign, ensuring that England remained stable, her authority respected, and her survival secure. As she prepared to ascend to the throne, Elizabeth carried the lessons of her youth and adolescence, the need for vigilance, the importance of perception, the value of knowledge, and the centrality of strategic patience. Every interaction, every decision, every observation contributed to her capacity to rule effectively, manage threats, and cultivate loyalty. The challenges she had faced prepared her not only to inherit a crown, but to wield it with intelligence, foresight, and unwavering discipline. In this crucible of threat and preparation, Elizabeth emerged as a leader capable of navigating a world of uncertainty, intrigue, and danger. She had learned that survival depended on careful observation, measured action, and the continuous assessment of human behavior. Her education experiences and reflections had produced a mind equipped for the extraordinary responsibilities of queenship, ready to meet the demands of authority, and prepared to endure the pressures of power for decades to come. Elizabeth's reign, while marked by diplomacy and domestic strategy, was not without internal challenges. England, a nation of diverse factions, religious divisions, and ambitious nobles, occasionally erupted into rebellion or unrest. The delicate balance of loyalty and authority required constant vigilance, careful management, and decisive action. Handling rebellion and maintaining order became a defining aspect of Elizabeth's kingship, testing her strategic foresight, intelligence, and leadership under pressure. Rebellion often emerged from both ideological and personal motivations. Some were rooted in religious tension, as Catholic factions or dissenting Protestants challenged royal authority. Others arose from political ambition, local grievances, or discontent with economic policies. Elizabeth's understanding of these varied causes allowed her to respond with discernment, tailoring strategies to neutralize threats, while avoiding unnecessary escalation. Each incident required assessment, anticipation, and precise execution. The role of intelligence and observation was paramount. Elizabeth's spy master Francis Walsingham provided critical information about potential conspiracies, plots, and emerging threats. Networks of informants and coded correspondence delivered insights into the intentions and loyalties of individuals and factions. Elizabeth, skilled in analyzing both content and subtext, interpreted these reports with caution and strategic foresight. This proactive approach enabled her to prevent crises before they fully materialized, demonstrating the value of foresight in governance. Military readiness, while primarily defensive, played a psychological and practical role in suppressing rebellion. Elizabeth maintained a network of loyal forces, regional militias, and trained soldiers prepared to respond swiftly to uprisings. The display of readiness served as both deterrent and reassurance. Potential rebels recognized the crown's capacity to act decisively, while loyal subjects felt protected under stable governance. Coordination between central authority and local enforcers ensured rapid and effective responses when necessary. The management of court factions remained critical in times of unrest. Nobles often sought to exploit rebellion for personal gain, shifting loyalties or subtly undermining authority. Elizabeth's careful observation, selective engagement, and strategic appointments ensured that court dynamics reinforced stability, rather than exacerbating tension. She balanced rewards and consequences, reinforcing loyalty while neutralizing potential threats. Every interaction, decision, and gesture was a calculated element in a broader strategy of order and cohesion. Legal and administrative measures complemented military and political strategies. Courts, justices, and local officials were empowered to enforce laws and maintain public order, yet their authority required monitoring. Elizabeth emphasized fairness, consistency, and diligence in enforcement, recognizing that perception of justice strengthened loyalty and deterred rebellion. By combining legal authority with strategic observation, she maintained order while reinforcing legitimacy and trust in governance. Religious rebellion presented unique challenges. Catholic uprisings, motivated by faith and allegiance to foreign powers, required both suppression and strategic diplomacy. Elizabeth balanced firmness with prudence, ensuring that punitive measures were proportionate while addressing underlying causes of dissent. Intelligence gathering, negotiation, and selective intervention allowed her to manage ideological unrest without provoking widespread rebellion or foreign intervention. Her nuanced approach reflected both political acumen and an understanding of human motivation. Economic conditions influenced stability as well. Poor harvests, taxation disputes, and local grievances could ignite unrest. Elizabeth's administration monitored conditions carefully, implementing measures to alleviate hardship, maintain trade, and sustain public confidence. Economic stability was closely linked to loyalty, and by addressing root causes of discontent, Elizabeth reinforced the resilience of the kingdom. Strategic allocation of resources, oversight of local governance, and responsiveness to reports ensured that potential triggers for rebellion were mitigated. Communication and perception played critical roles in maintaining order. Public proclamations, speeches, and symbolic gestures were carefully orchestrated to convey authority, fairness, and responsiveness. Elizabeth's presence, demeanor, and articulation influenced public sentiment, reinforcing loyalty and discouraging dissent. The ability to project calm confidence while demonstrating vigilance was essential to sustaining both perception and reality of stability. Elizabeth's personal engagement with key figures was central to crisis management. Advisors, nobles, and regional leaders were consulted, guided, and, when necessary, disciplined. Her ability to assess loyalty, discern hidden motives, and apply appropriate influence reinforced order and minimized the risk of escalation. Strategic use of persuasion, reassurance, and subtle authority allowed her to maintain control even in moments of tension. Psychological resilience was essential. Handling rebellion required composure, patience, and the capacity to make decisions under stress. Elizabeth's early training in observation, reflection, and strategy equipped her to manage emotional pressure, anticipate outcomes, and respond with deliberate action. Mental discipline allowed her to navigate crises without impulsiveness, ensuring that responses were measured, effective, and aligned with long-term objectives. The integration of intelligence, diplomacy, military preparedness, and administrative oversight, Elizabeth's comprehensive approach to governance. Rebellion was managed not through brute force alone, but through a combination of foresight, observation, strategic intervention, and careful communication. This multi-faceted approach reinforced authority, maintained stability, and strengthened the perception of competence and control. Elizabeth also learned from each instance of unrest, observing the causes, outcomes, and reactions of both allies and adversaries provided invaluable insights for future governance. Patterns of loyalty, ambition, and dissent were noted, informing decisions, appointments, and policy. Each episode of rebellion reinforced lessons in strategy, human behavior, and the complex interplay between authority and perception. Even periods of relative calm demanded attention. Elizabeth recognized that latent dissatisfaction, factional tension, and ideological disagreement persisted beneath the surface. Continuous vigilance, monitoring, and subtle management ensured that potential crises were addressed before they escalated. Observation, reflection, and strategic action became habitual practices, enabling Elizabeth to maintain long-term stability in a dynamic and complex environment. Elizabeth's handling of rebellion and domestic unrest reinforced the broader principles of her reign: vigilance, strategic foresight, observation, and subtle influence. By integrating intelligence, diplomacy, legal authority, and military readiness, she maintained stability and order without over-reliance on force or fear. Each decision, intervention, and observation contributed to a resilient governance structure, capable of withstanding both immediate and latent challenges. Through this combination of strategy, observation, and disciplined action, Elizabeth strengthened both the authority of the crown and the cohesion of the kingdom. Her capacity to anticipate threats, manage human behavior, and integrate multiple tools of governance ensured that rebellion was contained, order was maintained, and the perception of competence was reinforced. These lessons, honed over years of preparation and experience, became a defining feature of her enduring leadership. Elizabeth's approach to maintaining order exemplified her mastery of governance. By blending intelligence, diplomacy, legal oversight, and strategic intervention, she navigated crises with composure and foresight. Her ability to integrate knowledge, observation, and subtle authority created a stable, resilient state, capable of responding to internal challenges while reinforcing loyalty and cohesion. This period of her reign solidified her reputation as a capable, vigilant, and strategic ruler, prepared to endure both threat and challenge with intelligence, discipline, and grace. Elizabeth's reign, while defined by external diplomacy and religious prudence, relied equally on the careful management of domestic affairs. England, a nation still recovering from the turbulence of previous reigns, required stability, effective governance, and policies that reinforced loyalty and cohesion. Domestic administration was a subtle, continuous effort, demanding intelligence, observation, and strategic foresight. Every decision, from law enforcement to economic regulation, shaped perception, influenced loyalty, and strengthened authority. One of Elizabeth's earliest priorities was consolidating royal authority while respecting the influence of local governance. Nobles, sheriffs, and justices of the peace wielded considerable power across the country, and their cooperation was essential. Elizabeth understood that effective administration depended not solely on decrees from the crown, but on a network of competent and loyal intermediaries. Through careful appointments, assessment of character, and monitoring of performance, she ensured that her policies were implemented with consistency and fairness, reinforcing both governance and trust. Economic policy was central to domestic stability. England's prosperity depended on trade, agriculture, and the prudent management of royal finances. Elizabeth engaged closely with her advisors, analyzing reports on taxation, trade agreements, and resource allocation. She recognized the importance of balancing fiscal responsibility with the need to support infrastructure, defense, and public welfare. By integrating practical governance with strategic planning, Elizabeth reinforced the economic foundation of the kingdom, ensuring that wealth, stability, and loyalty were interdependent. Legal reform and the enforcement of justice were key elements of her domestic strategy. Elizabeth observed that the perception of fairness, consistency, and accountability was as important as the content of the law itself. courts, judges, and local officials were expected to uphold royal authority while administering justice effectively. Elizabeth monitored outcomes, assessed compliance, and intervened subtly when necessary. By cultivating a reputation for measured, equitable governance, she reinforced both the legitimacy of her authority and the loyalty of her subjects. Religious policy within England also intersected with domestic governance. Enforcement of the Elizabethan religious settlement required careful oversight, balancing public conformity with tolerance for private belief. Elizabeth relied on local clergy, magistrates, and observers to maintain compliance, while avoiding overt oppression that could provoke unrest. This nuanced approach reinforced stability, allowing her to govern a nation marked by diversity of belief, without alienating significant segments of the population. Education, culture, and intellectual life were integral to Elizabeth's vision for a strengthened kingdom. She encouraged learning, patronized the arts, and supported scholarly endeavors. By cultivating a climate of intellectual engagement and cultural flourishing, Elizabeth reinforced national pride, inspired loyalty, and strengthened the social fabric. These policies also projected an image of a sophisticated, enlightened monarchy, enhancing both domestic and international perception of authority. Elizabeth's approach to policy was characterized by observation, foresight, and subtle influence. She monitored the activities of local officials, assessed compliance with royal directives, and responded to potential challenges before they escalated. This continuous vigilance ensured that the machinery of governance functioned efficiently, that loyalty was maintained, and that potential threats were addressed with discretion and strategic precision. The management of court factions continued to intersect with domestic policy. Appointments, rewards, and responsibilities were calibrated to balance competing interests, reinforce loyalty, and mitigate rivalry. Elizabeth's ability to observe behavior, anticipate reactions, and make decisions informed by both principle and strategy allowed her to maintain cohesion within her administration. Each interaction, each decision, and each subtle adjustment contributed to a broader framework of stable, effective governance. Public perception remained central to Elizabeth's domestic strategy. Her actions, speeches, and appearances were carefully orchestrated to convey competence, and authority. Festivals, ceremonial events, and public addresses served not only as tradition, but also as instruments of governance, reinforcing loyalty, projecting stability, and demonstrating engagement with the populace. Every gesture was calculated to maintain the delicate balance between accessibility and authority. The psychological demands of domestic administration were considerable. Continuous assessment of officials, monitoring of compliance, and anticipation of challenges required mental discipline, patience, and composure. Elizabeth's capacity to internalize stress, reflect on complex scenarios, and act with precision distinguished her leadership style. Her ability to integrate observation, strategy, and decision-making reinforced both governance and her personal resilience. Elizabeth's domestic policies were also informed by historical precedent and careful reflection. Lessons drawn from previous reigns, observation of human behavior, and analysis of political patterns provided guidance in crafting measures that were effective and sustainable. She understood that stability was not achieved through authority alone, but through consistent, strategic, and responsive governance that addressed both immediate needs and long-term challenges. Infrastructure, defense, and the management of resources were also critical aspects of domestic administration. Elizabeth coordinated efforts to maintain roads, ports, and communication networks, ensuring that both commerce and governance functioned efficiently. Military readiness, while primarily defensive, served as both a practical safeguard and a symbol of royal authority. Investment in these areas reinforced the perception of a competent, prepared, and authoritative monarchy. Elizabeth's approach to social policy emphasized the integration of governance, culture, and observation. She supported initiatives that promoted education, civic engagement, and cultural development, while monitoring the effects on loyalty, compliance, and public sentiment. This comprehensive approach reinforced the interdependence of stability, prosperity, and perception, allowing her to strengthen the kingdom in a holistic, strategic manner. Even in the most mundane aspects of governance, Elizabeth applied observation, reflection and foresight. Administrative reports, correspondence, and daily briefings were analyzed critically, allowing her to identify trends, anticipate challenges, and respond with appropriate measures. Her disciplined approach ensured that decision-making was informed, deliberate, and aligned with both strategic objectives and practical considerations. By balancing authority, strategic foresight, and practical governance, Elizabeth established a foundation of domestic stability that reinforced her broader policy objectives. Her ability to integrate economic, legal, religious, and social considerations allowed her to maintain cohesion, inspire loyalty, and project competence. Each policy, decision, and subtle adjustment contributed to a resilient, enduring monarchy capable of withstanding both internal and external pressures. Elizabeth's domestic administration exemplified the principles that would define her entire reign: vigilance, strategic foresight, observation and subtle influence. Through careful management of officials, policies, and perception, she strengthened the kingdom, maintained stability, and reinforced her authority. The lessons of observation, education, and reflection were applied in governance, ensuring that England remained resilient, prosperous, and cohesive under her leadership. In summary, Elizabeth's approach to domestic policy combined intelligence, observation, and strategic action. She understood that authority was sustained not through power alone, but through careful management of relationships, resources, and perception. By integrating these elements, she created a governance model that strengthened the kingdom, maintained stability, and prepared England for the challenges and opportunities of both the present and the future.